On a cold January morning in 2025, delegates from 9 countries walked through the historic streets of The Hague, carrying with them more than simple diplomatic documents. They bore the hope of a new era for international law. The Dutch city, known worldwide for housing the main international courts of justice, would witness the birth of one of the most important diplomatic coalitions of the decade, the Hague Group. But to understand the magnitude of this historic moment, we need to go back in time. For over 500 days, the world watched an unprecedented escalation of violence in Gaza. While international bodies issued resolutions and warrants, impunity persisted, protected by systematic vetoes in the UN Security Council. International law, laboriously built after the atrocities of World War II, faced its gravest credibility crisis. The images arriving daily from Palestinian territories showed a devastating reality. Destroyed hospitals, bombed schools, entire families disappeared. Millions of people took to the streets worldwide, demanding an end to the atrocities. But their voices seemed to echo in a void, ignored by governments that called themselves democratic, but remained inert in the face of human suffering. It was in this context of frustration and indignation that a different response was born. No longer a symbolic declaration or rhetorical condemnation, but a platform for coordinated action that sought to restore the credibility of the international legal system. The Hague Group emerged, not as another protest movement, but as a concrete initiative to enforce international law when the great powers failed in their responsibilities. The choice of The Hague as the birthplace of the group was not casual. This city symbolizes humanity's aspiration for international justice. Housing both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, on January 31, 2025, representatives from 9 countries gathered in a conference room near these temples of justice, aware that they were about to write a new chapter in diplomatic history. The meeting was facilitated by the Progressive International, an organization that brings together progressive movements, activists, and intellectuals from around the world. David Adler, co-general coordinator of the organization, explained that the initiative arose from observing the ruins of the international law system. For over 500 days, everyone witnessed how certain nations, supported by their Western allies, engaged in totally criminal behavior, perpetrating what many experts characterized as genocide. The 9 founding countries represented diverse geography, but united by common historical experiences. South Africa brought its moral authority as a leader in the fight against apartheid and protagonist in the case presented to the International Court of Justice. The plurinational state of Bolivia contributed its tradition of defending indigenous rights and its experience in resisting imperialism. Colombia, which would assume the group's co-presidency, offered its expertise in peace processes and national reconciliation. Cuba arrived at the table with its long history of resistance to American imperialism, while Honduras represented the voice of Central America, frequently neglected in major international debates. From Asia, Malaysia brought the perspective of the Islamic world in Southeast Asia, a region that knows well the challenges of national self-determination. The African continent was represented by 3 nations with particular experiences in liberation processes. Namibia, which won its independence after decades of South African occupation, intimately understood the Palestinian situation. Senegal contributed its traditional leadership in human rights issues on the African continent. Subsequently, Belize would join the group, expanding Central American representation. The geopolitical analysis of the members reveals common characteristics that explain their cohesion. All are global South countries that experienced colonialism and developed a deep understanding of the challenges of national self-determination. Their non-aligned positions in international relations allowed them to take independent stances. Without the pressures that constrain many European and Arab nations, the initial absence of Arab and European countries in the group's formation was not accidental. It reflected the fact that defending international law had become politicized and costly, especially under American hegemony. The Trump administration had supported legislation to sanction anyone involved in international criminal court investigations against the United States or its allies. It's challenging Washington to defend international law. It's carried political and economic risks that many leaders were not yet willing to assume. When Versha Gandhi Kotanalutla, co-general coordinator of the Progressive International, spoke that January morning. Her description of the group was precise and ambitious. The Hague Group was constituted as a platform for collective action at national, international, and multilateral levels, committed to defending international law and holding accountable those who systematically violate it. The group's main objectives emerged from a careful analysis of the current international system's failures. First, they sought to defend international law not just in theory, but through concrete actions that demonstrated that international norms have real consequences. Second, they intended to hold Israel accountable for documented violations of international law, especially those related to the Genocide Convention and the Geneva Conventions. The third objective focused on actively supporting Palestinian self-determination, recognizing that the Palestinian question had become a crucial test for the international system's credibility. Finally, the group sought to restore the credibility of the multilateral system, demonstrating that smaller countries, acting in coordination, could effectively implement international law, even when great powers failed in their responsibilities. The legal foundation of the group's actions was solid and comprehensive. They were based on the Genocide Convention, which obliges all states to prevent and punish genocide, and the Geneva Conventions, which establish protective measures for civilian populations under occupation. Resolution A, Res ES 10, 24th of the UN General Assembly, adopted in September 2024, provided additional institutional support by endorsing the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion. The International Court of Justice's advisory opinion of July 2024 had been particularly significant. In it, the UN's principal judicial body concluded that Israeli settlement policies violated international law and characterized the occupation as illegal, demanding the return of lands to their original residents displaced since 1967. The arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant in November 2024 provided a clear legal basis for individual accountability actions. The group also drew inspiration from successful historical precedents. UN Security Council Resolutions 418 and 591 had imposed mandatory arms embargoes against South Africa during apartheid, demonstrating that the international community could, when there was political will, implement effective measures against regimes that systematically violated international law. The group's organizational structure reflected its commitment to equality and horizontal cooperation. Colombia assumed the co-presidency, not due to hierarchical superiority, but because of its capacity to host meetings and coordinate actions. A secretariat was established to facilitate communication between members and coordinate the group's activities. The decision-making process was based on consensus, ensuring that all members had equal voice in important decisions. The Hague Group's first public declaration was a carefully crafted document that balanced diplomatic language with concrete commitments. The text began with an unequivocal condemnation of what it characterized as genocide in Gaza, specifically referencing the International Court of Justice's provisional orders in the South Africa versus Israel case. The declaration noted with concern the serious concerns about the perpetration of genocide crimes in Palestine, and the significant and diverse number of states that joined as third-party states in the case. The document did not limit itself to rhetorical condemnations. The group members formally committed to complying with the arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court against Netanyahu and Gallant, declaring that they would arrest them if they entered their jurisdictions. This was not a symbolic position, but a legal commitment that effectively restricted the international mobility of the accused. The declaration also demanded the immediate end of the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, referencing not only the 2024 advisory opinion, but also the earlier 2004 opinion on the legal consequences of the wall's construction in occupied Palestinian territory. The group members committed to implementing all necessary measures to ensure that their jurisdictions did not contribute to maintaining the illegal situation created by Israel. 5 months later, the Bogotá Declaration marked a significant escalation in the group's approach. The emergency conference held between July 15th to 16th, 2025, was convened in response to Israel's continuing and growing violations of international law. This second meeting demonstrated the group's ability to attract broader international support. With representatives from over 30 countries participating in the discussions, The Bogotá Declaration was read by Colombian Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs, Mauricio Jaramillo Jazir, and represented a qualitative leap in the proposed measures. Participants agreed to prevent the supply or transfer of weapons, ammunition, military fuel, related military equipment, and dual-use equipment to Israel. This was not a vague recommendation, but a specific operational commitment that countries began implementing immediately. The Bogotá document also established measures to prevent the transit and docking of vessels carrying military supplies to Israel, creating a network of restrictions that could effectively disrupt military supply chains. Countries further committed to initiating an urgent review of all public contracts to ensure that public institutions and public funds did not support the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. One of the group's most significant positions was its response to American sanctions against the International Criminal Court. When the Trump administration intensified its threats against ICC officials, the Hague Group responded with firm condemnation, characterizing the sanctions as an unprecedented attack on international law. This position demonstrated that the group was willing to directly confront American pressure, establishing an important precedent for defending international legal sovereignty. The group members also expressed mutual solidarity in the face of external pressures. They recognized that challenging great powers to defend international law involved risks, but argued that the cost of inaction would be even greater. As David Adler from the Progressive International explained, it was about trying to save what remained of the multilateral system, not about attacking any specific state, but about renewing and strengthening international justice structures. When the Hague Group committed to an arms embargo, it was not making merely a symbolic declaration. Member countries immediately began implementing concrete measures to suspend all transfers of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to Israel. This action was particularly significant because it also included dual-use equipment, those that can have civilian and military applications, demonstrating a comprehensive approach to prevent any contribution to violations of international law. The embargo implementation went beyond simple sales prohibitions. Member countries established rigorous controls over the transit of military materials through their territorial waters and ports. Vessels suspected of transporting military supplies to Israel were prohibited from docking or transiting through member countries' jurisdictions. Namibia had given a concrete example of this policy in August 2024, when it denied the MV Catherine the right to dock at Walvis Bay port, suspecting it was carrying military cargo to Israel. The economic impact of these measures began to be felt immediately. International military supply chains depend on a complex network of maritime and air routes, and the coordination among Hague Group countries created significant gaps in this network. Maritime transport companies had to reevaluate their routes, and military suppliers faced additional costs to circumvent the restrictions. The implementation of International Criminal Court arrest warrants represented another crucial aspect of the group's actions. When Netanyahu and Gallant were indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity, Hague Group member countries publicly committed to executing the warrants should the accused enter their jurisdictions. This position was not merely symbolic, but created real practical consequences for Israeli leaders' international mobility. The commitment to ICC warrants established an important precedent for universal jurisdiction. It demonstrated that smaller countries, acting in coordination, could effectively implement international tribunal decisions, even when great powers tried to sabotage them. This action strengthened the credibility of the international criminal justice system and sent a clear message that impunity would not be tolerated. The diplomatic measures implemented by the group were equally significant. Member countries initiated a coordinated process of political isolation of Israel, reducing diplomatic relations and canceling official visits. This isolation was accompanied by campaigns in multilateral bodies, where Hague Group countries worked to mobilize additional support for their positions. Solidarity with Palestine manifested through concrete support, not only political, but also humanitarian and economic. Member countries increased their assistance to Palestinian territories and strengthened their relations with Palestinian institutions, effectively recognizing the legitimacy of Palestinian national aspirations. The economic actions implemented were particularly innovative. The urgent review of public contracts promised in the Bogotá Declaration began immediately, with countries carefully examining all government agreements that could somehow support the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories? This review included not only obvious military contracts, but also commercial, technological, and infrastructure agreements that could indirectly contribute to maintaining the occupation. Divestment from Israeli companies became a coordinated policy, with public funds being withdrawn from companies operating in occupied territories or contributing to the occupation infrastructure. This divestment policy, inspired by the successful movement against South African apartheid, began to have measurable economic impacts on the Israeli economy. The American government's reaction to the Hague Group was swift and hostile, demonstrating that Washington perceived the initiative as a serious threat to its regional interests. President Trump intensified his threats of sanctions against the International Criminal Court, announcing punitive measures against anyone or any institution that supported investigations against Israel. This escalation revealed American nervousness at the possibility that other countries would follow the Hague Group's example. American diplomatic pressure intensified considerably. Trump administration representatives directly contacted the governments of Hague Group member countries, offering economic incentives to abandon their positions and threatening commercial retaliation for those who persisted. This pressure campaign demonstrated how far Washington was willing to go to protect Israel from international accountability. However, the aggressiveness of the American response only strengthened the group's determination and expanded international support for its cause. The growing isolation of the United States on the international stage became evident when even traditional allies began questioning the legitimacy of sanctions against international justice institutions. American moral credibility, already shaken by its complicity with Israeli violations, suffered additional damage from its attempts to sabotage international justice mechanisms. In Europe, reactions were complex and revealed deep internal divisions. Spain participated in the Bogotá Conference as an observer, but the Spanish government officially did not endorse the meeting's conclusions. This ambiguous position reflected the contradictory pressures that European countries faced between their international legal responsibilities and their political alliances with Washington. However, the decision by Yolanda Díaz, Spain's second vice president, to individually sign the Bogotá Declaration created a diplomatically embarrassing situation. This division within the Spanish government itself demonstrated how the Palestinian question was creating tensions even within European governments traditionally aligned with the United States. The growing pressure on the European Union to review its relations with Israel became evident when the European Commission agreed to reevaluate the EU-Israel Association Agreement. This review, although belated, represented an implicit recognition that Israeli conduct had become incompatible with declared European values. However, critics argued that these measures came too late and were insufficient to deter ongoing violence. Israel's reaction was predictable but revealing. The Israeli government immediately denounced the Hague Group as a manifestation of anti-Semitism, trying to delegitimize its actions through the instrumentalization of Holocaust memory. This strategy, while familiar, proved less effective than in the past, as many international observers began to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israeli policy and anti-Semitic prejudice. Israel also intensified its attempts to isolate Hague Group member countries, using its influence in the United States to pressure for punitive measures. The Israeli government canceled commercial agreements with some member countries and withdrew its ambassadors in diplomatic protest gestures. However, these measures had limited impact, as many Hague Group countries did not maintain substantial commercial relations with Israel. The continuation of Israeli violations of international law, despite growing international pressure, demonstrated the Netanyahu government's determination to ignore international norms. This defiant stance only strengthened the Hague Group's determination and provided additional justification for its actions. International support for the Hague Group grew significantly in the months following its formation. Countries like Indonesia, Iraq, Libya, Nicaragua, Oman, St. Vincent and the Grenadines formally adhered to the Bogotá Declaration, demonstrating that the movement was gaining momentum. This growth reflected a broader shift in international public opinion, which was becoming increasingly critical of Israeli impunity. International civil society organizations also mobilized significant support for the group's actions. Human rights movements, religious organizations, and social justice groups worldwide expressed solidarity with the implemented measures. This civil society mobilization created additional pressure on reluctant governments to adopt firmer positions in defense of international law. Despite its initial successes, the Hague Group faced significant structural limitations that could not be ignored. The geopolitical reality was that the member countries, while morally correct and legally justified, were medium and small-sized nations with limited economic and military power. Their actions, however coordinated, faced the limits imposed by an international system still dominated by great powers. Economic pressures represented a particular challenge. The group's member countries faced retaliation from Israel's allies, including cancellation of commercial agreements, restrictions on market access, and pressure on international financial institutions. These pressures were especially difficult for developing countries that depended on international commercial relations for their economic growth. The need for expansion became increasingly clear. While the group had managed to attract new members, its effectiveness depended fundamentally on its ability to grow and include countries with greater economic and political weight. The adhesion of regional powers like Brazil, Turkey, or Indonesia could significantly transform the impact of the group's actions. However, the growth prospects were promising. The Hague Group was managing to articulate a convincing vision of multilateralism renewal for the 21st century. Drawing inspiration from the historical experience of the non-aligned countries movement during the Cold War, this new version of non-alignment was not based on neutrality between ideological blocs, but on the active defense of international law principles against great power impunity. The historical experience of the movement against South African apartheid offered valuable lessons and reasons for optimism. That movement had demonstrated that coordinated action by the international community could effectively pressure regimes that violated international law, even when protected by powerful allies. The gradual isolation of the apartheid regime through economic sanctions, cultural and sports embargoes, and sustained diplomatic pressure had eventually contributed to its fall. The strength of global South unity became evident as more countries began to recognize that they had common interests in strengthening the international law system. Israeli impunity was not just a Palestinian issue, but a test for the entire multilateral system. If Israel could systematically violate international law without consequences, what guarantees did other smaller countries have that their own sovereignties would be respected? The next steps for the Hague Group included expanding the number of members and developing new, more effective measures. Discussions were underway about creating a specific international tribunal for colonization crimes, implementing broader economic sanctions, developing alternative international cooperation mechanisms that would circumvent structures dominated by great powers. The long-term impact of the Hague Group could be transformative for the international system. If successful, the group could demonstrate that it is possible to reform multilateralism from below, creating coalitions of smaller countries committed to principles rather than depending on the goodwill of great powers. This approach could inspire similar movements on other global issues, from climate change to international economic inequality. The historical legacy of the Hague Group was already beginning to take shape, regardless of its future successes or failures. The group had established an important precedent that smaller countries could act collectively to defend international law. This lesson would be valuable for future generations of diplomats and activists committed to building a more just world. The final message of the Hague Group transcended the specific Palestinian question. It represented an affirmation that international law was not just a set of abstract rules, but a living system that required active defense by those who believed in its principles. As David Adler observed, it was about trying to save what remained of the multilateral system, building a foundation for humanity to face the challenges of the 21st century through international cooperation based on law, not force. Its success or failure may influence not only the future of the Palestinian people, the fate of the multilateral system itself that humanity built to prevent a return to the barbarism of war and total impunity. Despite the long-term goal or message, one point is clear. Israel is the representation of colonialism in 21st century. We, especially from the global south, must stand up against the barbarity this ideology represents. We cannot simply stand by, or we will be burdened with the question for future generations. How did the world let this happen? And don't forget, like the video and subscribe the channel to keep thinking the world how it really is.